games are too expensive. Depending on who you ask, this means two different things. That games at retail and digital being priced at $70 is simply too much given the hit or miss nature of a lot of releases with regards to bugs, performance, completeness, or otherwise, or that the budgets being used to produce these games are simply too big of a risk and unsustainable for the industry. This isn't new. Former PlayStation executive Shawn Layden had this to say with regards to game budgets and game length. Quote, "The problem with that model is that it's just not sustainable." Speaking of the $80 to $150 million budgets for AAA games during the end of the PS4 era. Continuing on, he says, quote, "I don't think that in the next generation you can take those numbers and multiply them by 2 and think that you can grow. I think the industry as a whole needs to sit back and go, all right, what are we building? What's the audience expectation? What is the best way to get our story across and say what we need to say?" It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for the 50 to 60 hour gameplay milestone, because that's going to be much more expensive to achieve. And in the end, you may close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold they have to meet. We have to reevaluate that. Now mind you, this is back in 2020, at the end of the PS4 era and the onset of the PS5 era, where games like The Last of Us Part 2 and Ghost of Tsushima, both of which to complete everything will run you 30 to 50 hours, sometimes greater, where games like The Witcher 3 from 2015 and Fallout 4 released the same year with hundreds of hours of content and long branching single-player storylines that could take someone 20 to 30 hours to complete without doing any of the extra content. In Fallout 4 and The Witcher 3, for example, these are games with budgets of nearly $200 to $300 million, and the potential for failure is high. AAA games are big risks nowadays, with budgets exceeding now upwards of $300 million plus, and that's before marketing or licensing costs or anything. So, Shawn Layden and other executives, I'm sure, at Microsoft were feeling this kind of trepidation to greenlight games with these large of budgets, knowing that to succeed is to sell upwards of 10 plus million copies. Now, I bring this quote up because it's quite salient given the developments we've seen over the last month and a half, but even beyond further since the beginning of this generation. When Xbox started porting games to PC, Quantum Break was the beginning, but it certainly wasn't the end. Nowadays, every Xbox game comes to PC in some facet or another, and this continues on to this day. Microsoft's platform isn't just the Xbox console, it's the Xbox console and every Windows computer, and even mobile via cloud gaming. Sony's taken a similar approach with things like PS Now, although now that's sort of been rolled into PS Plus perks, releasing games like Helldivers 2 on PC day and date, their plans for Marathon, which will be on every single platform they can put it on, and likely the same with Concord and Fair Games, future live service games that we've yet to see concrete gameplay footage of, beyond teaser reels from last year's showcase. Shawn Layden in 2020 spoke to the reality that we find ourselves in today, which is that games are simply too expensive to continue on in the same fashion they have been for the last decade plus. Games are becoming increasingly more expensive and rather unwieldy. Teams can balloon up to 500 plus, even 1,000 developers in AAA games. Production timelines can exceed 5+ years for new games from start to finish, from concept to release. And when you look at the decisions Microsoft and Sony have made, Microsoft more recently, but Sony since the acquisition of Nixxes back in 2021, you start to see that both of these companies have been preparing for a future in which they are more nimble and able to act in ways previously seen unlikely with regards to content and content exclusivity. Microsoft is obviously porting their next 4 games to PlayStation and Nintendo in Hi-Fi Rush, Sea of Thieves, Grounded, and Pentiment, some of which are already out today. And when you think about how much games cost, to lock them down to one ecosystem is simply to fail before you begin. There's certainly been some acquisition of users to Game Pass through subscriptions to be able to access that content, but that acquisition of subscribers is clearly not enough to satiate the revenue generation they must meet as a publicly traded company in the name of growth. Those 4 games are simply not going to be the last that migrate to other platforms, and Sony's not far behind. The headwinds of game budgets and cost of production are a common one between Microsoft and Sony. While Microsoft is migrating content elsewhere, Sony is doing similar with Helldivers 2 and planning to do more with its other upcoming live service games. While many read comments from Kenichiro Yoshida, Sony CEO, as confirmation that Sony will simply follow suit almost lockstep with Microsoft, I think quoting him here will give a bit more context to what they value as their core business. This comes from an interview with Nikolai Tangent of the Norges Bank Investment Management and an extended interview which can be found on YouTube. Kenichiro Yoshida is asked, quote, "How do you see the future of gaming?" And he answers, "In short, it'd be ubiquitous. Wherever there is computing, users will be able to play their favorite games seamlessly. Gamers will be able to find a place to play in different spaces. While PlayStation will remain our core product, we will expand our gaming experiences to PC, mobile, and cloud. So this quote, accompanied with Helldiver's success and accompanied with the purchase of Nixxes back in 2021, which has certainly allowed Sony to deliver its other core first-party titles to PC, albeit in a delayed state. It's clear that the cost of these games has necessitated that it be spread further and wider to recoup as much revenue as possible, while still trying to retain the essence of their platforms and brands, respectively. Game Pass isn't going to any other platform. Xbox players both on console and PC will still have a unique proposition in the way that they engage the content. And Sony still hasn't committed to doing anything with first party outside of likely releasing it to PC in a staggered release schedule. Still, it makes you wonder, beyond just porting games to other platforms, how do you grapple with the increased costs and the increased spending demands of AAA development, or even AA development, in a world where inflation tops 10% plus, and AAA games require teams of hundreds, if not thousands, to create? I think a good case study for how to develop AAA games while still keeping development budgets in check and keeping teams tight is Remedy. Remedy, hot off the heels of Alan Wake 2, announced this month during their financial results that Alan Wake was the fastest selling game they've ever had, selling 1.3 million copies. Remedy signed a deal in 2020 with Epic Games for both a AAA game and a smaller scale project. Remedy had this to say with regards to the deal when it was revealed back in February 2021, quote, "Both projects are based on Remedy's own IP and we retain the IP ownership. Epic fully funds the development and has committed to significant marketing investment. After the development and publishing costs have been recouped from game sales, the net revenues will be shared 50-50 between Epic and Remedy." Now, we know that Alan Wake's budget was $50 million and $20 million for marketing. And based on this deal, Epic has funded all of that and then split revenues 50-50 with Remedy post recouped costs of the $70 million. Control released in 2019, and the following year had a complete edition released at $40 with all DLC. The game has since sold 4 million copies and was made for a budget of 50 million euro. In contrast, a game like Spider-Man 2, which had a $300 million budget, $200 million plus licensing fee, and that's not accounting for marketing costs, was revealed to have sold over 10 million units just last week. And the contrast between these projects, Control, Alan Wake, and Spider-Man, paints an interesting picture, risking 50 or 70 million versus risking 500 plus million to develop games. Now, we know from this month's financial results from Warner Brothers that despite a great year last year selling 22 million plus copies of Hogwarts Legacy, by their own words, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, quote, "fell short of expectations." Now, it's probably true that they forecasted this game to be doing much better than it does, and maybe even in similar fashions to Hogwarts Legacy, which I would view as a misstep given the IP being leveraged in Hogwarts Legacy. But it's reasonable to assume that Suicide Squad cost Warner Brothers between $200 to $300 million to create, possibly more when you account for marketing costs. The game is Rocksteady's only project since launching Arkham Knight back in 2015. All of these projects, when looked at next to each other, paints an interesting picture. Successful games like Spider-Man 2 can see that large amounts of spending can beget larger amounts of profit, but in contrast, larger amounts of spending can beget catastrophic losses like with Suicide Squad: The Justice League. Platform holders who own game studios and game publishers who operate independently are at a crossroads. Which games do you greenlight? The safe sequels to IP that have a proven track record in sales? Or new takes on existing IP or franchise, or even new IP altogether that must be forecasted against budgets in the hundreds of millions? Going back to what Sean Layden said, he speaks to this idea that maybe it's better if we start working on games and creating games as an industry that don't require or ask 50 to 100 hours of players, but maybe just 15 to 20. Games that are more digestible and more sustainably created. While it's certainly not true that an apples-to-apples comparison can be made that if you make a 100-hour game, a 50-hour game would certainly cost half the time and half the resources. But is it better to risk $50 million making something like Control, or $300 million plus on something like Suicide Squad: The Justice League? Games are too expensive to take large creative risks like this unless you have the deep pockets and the deep confidence that your studios can deliver. And we see how platform holders are hedging their bets. Microsoft pushing everything out as far and as wide as it can. Sony in a half step between putting things on PC and mobile and holding things back for its console. And Nintendo simply doing what it wants since the Switch's breakout success in 2017. Remedy is a good example of how you can temper budgets, define scope, and make smaller games that are still just as AAA and just as flashy and just as premium feeling as something like Spider-Man 2 or something like an Elden Ring, while exercising some restraint, given the smaller scope. At the onset of this generation, games increased from $60 to $70. The incremental increase in game costs simply does not make up for things like inflation, which have now topped well above what the increase was percentage-wise for game prices. It's likely we'll see another increase next generation. Based on these increased cost headwinds, I think a few things must be true for Microsoft and Sony as they continue onwards with their businesses. One, that costs are going to increase for the consumer. This means the jump from $70 to $80 will be faster than the jump from $60 to $70, or will be done in a roundabout way by pushing more content towards higher cost editions of games and leaning more on perks like early access, which have proven to be very successful for games like Hogwarts Legacy from last year. 2, that these companies will continue to find efficiencies where they can with things like AI, which unfortunately will be used for game creation, though I hope it will remain as far away from the truly artistic and creative parts of the business. And 3, that headcounts will reduce, or that studios that were previously large singular teams may in fact be summed up and divided into smaller teams that can incubate and produce more projects on quicker timelines with smaller budgets. In a world where costs continue to increase exponentially from where they were a decade plus ago for the games industry, it simply cannot remain that the status quo remains the same, and for these studios and publishers and platform holders to continue on in the same way that they have. 10 years ago, nobody was selling a subscription service with large amounts of games in them, and yet now, things like Ubisoft Plus, Game Pass, PS Plus, Premium, these things are known quantities and commonplace within the industry. It only makes sense that things will further evolve. 10 years ago, it would have been unfathomable that Microsoft will be putting Xbox games on PC and that Sony will be putting games on PC today. And yet we live in a world where some of these games release day and date. So I think we'll see these business strategies further evolve as the year goes on, and we'll learn a lot more at the summer showcases. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.